Prynawn da, unwaith eto, thank you for joining me as we complete the latest 3-week review of the coronavirus regulations. Today, I will, as usual, provide an update on the outcome of that review and an account of the latest public health situation in Wales. And I also want to share details of our new plan published this morning to live safely with coronavirus in the future. Now, our relationship with the virus is changing thanks to the very high rates of vaccination we have, and because of everything that you have done to help control the spread of the virus and to keep Wales safe. This does not mean that the pandemic is over, but it does mean that the way we can manage coronavirus is changing. I'm going to start with a couple of familiar slides by now, which show how the public health situation has changed since the new year. This first slide shows the overall case rate in Wales. It's based on positive PCR tests, and it shows that enormous spike in coronavirus, the Omicron wave that began to affect us here in Wales in the second half of December, continued into January. But as you can see, since we hit the peak of the wave, the rates have been falling steadily, and the trend, even beyond when we got back to where we were before the peak, has continued to be downwards, and it's the lowest at any point in the time frame covered by the slide. On this measure, we have around 160 cases per 100,000 of the population in Wales. But we know that we also need to look at a wider range of measures than simply PCR tests if we are to have a full understanding of how the pandemic is behaving in Wales. The Office for National Statistics publishes a regular coronavirus infection survey, and it gives us a good indication of the level of infection here in Wales and in the rest of the United Kingdom. And the slide we're about to see shows the results of the latest ONS survey across Wales, across the United Kingdom, I beg your pardon. As ever, the figure for Wales is represented by the red line. You will see that just as in the last slide, it too shows the number of people testing positive for coronavirus falling in Wales. In the latest survey, those figures suggest that around 1 in 30 people in Wales had coronavirus at the end of February, and as you can see, levels of infection were lower in Wales than in any other part of the United Kingdom, and that those levels continue to be on that gradual downwards trajectory. Now, we've also seen falls in the number of positive cases reported in Welsh universities and a reduction in the number of school pupils absent due to COVID-19 in recent weeks. The number of people in hospital with COVID-19 is stable at around 830. And while it's good news that that figure isn't rising, at that level, still with nearly 1,000 people in a hospital bed associated with COVID-19, the pressures that that creates in the wider NHS remain very real, and with some serious and continuing knock-on consequences on other health services and treatments. Now, as I've said, the public health situation has improved thanks to the efforts that we have all made together in Wales over recent months. The result is that in this latest 3-week review of the regulations, Wales can remain at alert level 0. Protection from vaccination is very high, thanks to the incredible success of the vaccination programme and the willingness of people in Wales to come forward to be vaccinated. Almost 6.9 million doses of the vaccine have been delivered since the programme was launched, and that's only just over a year ago. All of that has saved thousands of lives and has significantly weakened the link between catching coronavirus and that becoming a serious illness. And the programme, of course, is not over. We'll be topping up people's protection by offering older and the most vulnerable people a further spring booster vaccine. And we'll be offering the vaccine to all 5 to 11-year-olds. And as I say, at each of these occasions, if you haven't yet had a vaccine or you haven't yet completed your course, it's never too late to come forward in Wales. Now, that combination of high vaccination rates and improving level of infections means that we are able to think about moving beyond the emergency response to the pandemic. This does not mean that the pandemic is over, but it does mean that we are able to think now about how we can live safely with the virus, just as we live with other infectious illnesses. Today, we've published a plan that sets out how we can do this, while ensuring that we can respond quickly if a new variant emerges or if we have another pandemic wave putting unsustainable pressure on our NHS. If the public health position remains favourable, we will start this transition by removing the legal underpinning of the measures we have lived with for the last 2 years. And we'll remove the legal requirements from the 28th of March. From that date, the legal requirement to wear face coverings will end. The legal requirement to self-isolate will end. And the legal requirement for businesses to carry out specific COVID risk assessments and take reasonable measures will end as well. But I want to be clear that the ways we have learned to behave and which have kept us safe during the pandemic will continue to be important after the 28th of March. While we have moved away from legal requirements, the Welsh Government will continue to provide guidance which will make it clear, for example, that we should self-isolate if we are ill with the virus. Businesses and employers will still be subject to the general health and safety requirements. And schools will continue to operate using the national framework, and for now, we're recommending that face coverings continue to be worn in communal indoor areas by all staff and secondary school-age students. Now, as part of living safely with coronavirus, we will also be making changes to testing. Between the end of this month and June, we will gradually move away from PCR and lateral flow tests being available to everyone, to those tests being targeted now towards the most vulnerable people and the most vulnerable places. We will do this in a phased and gradual way. From the 28th of March, the routine use of PCR tests for the general public will come to an end. Lateral flow tests instead will continue to be available to order free online for anyone with symptoms. PCR testing will continue to be used to test patients admitted to hospital, to test health and social care staff, care home residents and others in vulnerable settings. We'll make a level of testing still available for surveillance, and our TTP service will continue to operate above and beyond what is available now in England, where the UK government has, in a cliff edge way, dismantled its testing capacity. Now, as we approach the second anniversary of the pandemic, we can look forward with growing confidence that the next year will be one in which we will have this very different relationship with the virus. As we move beyond the emergency response, I know that some people, especially the most vulnerable, and those who have been shielding, will be anxious about this process. But I want to be clear that the plan that we have set out will go on protecting your health and well-being as we all learn to live safely with the virus. And by acting in that way, and by drawing on the lessons of everything we have been to over the last 2 years, together we can go on keeping one another safe. Diolch o galon I chi gyd, and today I'll take some questions from journalists, and as usual, all answers will be broadcast live on our own social media channels. And first of all, today over to Adrian Masters at ITV Wales.
Thank you, First Minister. And this is to pick up on your last point, really, which is that there will be some people today and in the coming weeks who are very anxious about the change in the regulations or the removal of the regulations. What is your, apart from saying that the advice remains for them to remain cautious, what steps are you taking to ensure that people with disabilities or who are otherwise vulnerable, more vulnerable to COVID, are protected? Because you can understand their anxiety that they will see that the people are not wearing masks and not necessarily social distancing, and they won't necessarily know whether that somebody that they're meeting has COVID or not. How can you assure them in this situation?
Well, look, first of all, to say that I entirely understand that people who've been at the sharpest end of the experience of the last 2 years and who've often only very cautiously themselves gone back into the world will be anxious as we move beyond the emergency stage. It's why I've been at pains to emphasise today that while we are moving beyond the legal requirements, the advice of the Welsh Government will remain very clear, that we should continue to draw on everything we have learned and everything we have done together. That while there won't be a legal requirement to wear a face covering in a crowded public place, for example, the advice will still be that wearing a face covering in such circumstances goes on offering a degree of protection to you and to others. So I think people in Wales have acted throughout the pandemic in a way that recognises not simply that those actions are helpful to them, but they're keen to ensure that other people are kept safe as well. And as we move beyond legal requirements and into living safely with the virus, the greatest assurance people who are most vulnerable will be if everybody else continues to do those simple things that will keep us all safe into the future.
Thank you. Is there a danger that phasing out mass testing by, I think by June, as you've just set out, will mean that a future variant may not be spotted? And if so, what contingencies have you got in place to try to ensure that doesn't happen?
I think that is a genuine anxiety. It is why we have attempted unsuccessfully to persuade the UK government to take a more gradual approach to the rundown of testing and the infrastructure that has served us so well over the last 2 years. Here in Wales, we will devote some of the testing that we have available to us through our own means, through Public Health Wales, for example, in ways that will allow surveillance to continue. Now, we're very lucky in Wales. We've had, throughout the pandemic, one of the best capacities for genomic sequencing anywhere in the world. And we've been able to put that to very good use. And by continuing to make that available, and some other things which will remain in place, we're optimistic, although not yet confirmed, that the UK government will continue, for example, with the ONS survey that I used in the slides earlier, that all of that together will give us a level of surveillance sufficient to be able to spot either a new variant arising spontaneously here in the United Kingdom, as we saw with what was then called the Kent variant, or with a variant from somewhere else in the world being imported into the United Kingdom. We continue to have conversations with the UK government about the need to ensure both that there is sufficient surveillance in place and that, should it be necessary to step up the level of protection again through a more widespread testing regime, that there's a proper plan and a proper capacity to be able to do that. Adrian, thank you very much. Over to Gareth Breyer at BBC Wales.
Thank you, First Minister. Ac os allwch chi ateb y cwestiynau nesaf yn Gymraeg hefyd, os gwelwch yn dda. Whilst you have said the pandemic isn't over, is this the moment that Wales actually starts to live with the virus?
Well, Gareth, I think Wales has been living with the virus for quite a long time now. During the summer of last year, the level of protections still required in Wales was at a pretty low level. And since we've come through the Omicron wave, we've been reducing that level of protection pretty steadily now for a number of weeks. What I think we are getting to is a steady state where we have stability in managing the virus, and that's why we are able to move from relying on the law to relying on the sort of guidance that, for example, kicks in if there's a measles outbreak somewhere. You know, there are other infectious diseases that we live with, and we have ways of managing them. We're on that part, we hope, pardon me, of the coronavirus journey, when we will be able to manage it in that more everyday way. But managing it does not mean ignoring it. It means taking sensible measures of the sort we've described today. So, yn fy marn ni wedi bod yn fyw gyda coronavirus am spel. Nawr, mae'r cyfyngiadau sydd da ni a hyn o bryd wedi dod lawr wythnos ar ôl y ton o Omicron. Y gobaith yw, ni nawr mewn lle ble allwn ni cynllunio i fyw, ond ni'n fyw yn diogel gyda'r coronavirus fel rhan o'r pethau sydd da ni, ond ni'n gallu ymdopi gyda'r lefel o'r coronavirus sydd ar gael, fel ni'n ymdopi gyda'r pethau eraill, fel y fraich goch. Mae hwnna'n codi ambell waith yng Nghymru, a ni'n gwybod sut i delio gyda'r effaith. Yn y dyfodol, y cynllun sy'n da ni yw ffordd i byw gyda coronavirus, ond mewn ffordd diogel, achos bydd coronavirus yn dal da ni. Mae'r virus ddim wedi diflannu.
Diolch. We've heard that health staff are concerned about the removal of the requirement to wear masks. Why not retain that legal requirement in health and care settings where the most vulnerable are treated? Won't vulnerable patients be put at unnecessary risk if the legal requirement to wear a mask is removed from health and care settings?
Well, the advice will still be very clear about the advisability of wearing face coverings in those vulnerable settings, and health staff who've expressed those views will absolutely be part of the ongoing message about the need to do so. I think the history of coronavirus in Wales has been about people being very aware themselves of doing the right thing, of doing the safe thing. I don't think that we will see a sudden cliff edge in people no longer doing the right thing because the law doesn't require them to do it. There's a good natural experiment that has happened here. As it happens, Scotland has never had a legal requirement to self-isolate. It's only ever been strong guidance from the Scottish Government. And there's no evidence that the levels of self-isolation in Scotland have been significantly different to the levels in Wales or in England, where we've had the law to underpin it. So I think, and it's a really important message today, that while the legal requirements, we hope, will be lifted on the 28th of March, the need to go on doing the right thing, particularly in vulnerable places like hospitals and care homes, will not have ended. So, am fy marn i, be ni wedi weld dros y cyfnod o'r pandemig i gyd, yw bobl yng Nghymru yn eisiau wneud y pethau go iawn, y pethau sy'n rhoi cymorth i bobl eraill. Wrth gwrs, mae gyfraith wedi fod na, ond dim just achos y gyfraith yn ddweud rhywbeth, am beth dwi wedi weld, dydy hwnna ddim y reswm pam mae pobl wedi bwrw mlaen i defnyddio mwgawdau i hunan yn ysu ac yn y blaen. Ac ar ôl yr 8 ar 20 o Fawrth, dwi'n meddwl bydd pobl yn dal i eisiau wneud y pethau sy'n cadw a hunan yn ddiogel ond sy'n helpu bobl eraill hefyd. Yn pan ni'n siarad am ysbytau, ble mae cartrefi preswyl ac yn y blaen, dwi'n siŵr bydd pobl sy'n gweithio yn y maes na a bobl sy'n defnyddio'r gwasanaethau, dydy nhw ddim yn eisiau wneud dim byd sy'n mynd i wneud niwed i bobl eraill, a gyda'r cyngor oddi wrth y Llywodraeth, dwi'n meddwl bydd pobl yn eisiau bwrw mlaen i wneud pethau sy'n cadw pobl eraill yn ddiogel rhag ofn bydd coronavirus yn dod nôl yn y bywydau nhw. Gareth, diolch yn fawr. Over now to Dan Bevan at LBC.
Thank you, First Minister. Good afternoon to you. Yourself and other ministers have continuously said throughout the pandemic, particularly when measures are easing, that restrictions won't remain in place a day longer than they actually need to. So with that in mind, why wait 3 weeks for these changes to be made in law? What scientific evidence do you have that backs up that changing in 3 weeks will be better than changing now? And can you rule out making these changes earlier than the 28th?
The advice that we have, Dan, from the Chief Medical Officer is that a further 3 weeks to make sure that we have got numbers continuing to come down and stability in our hospital system in the way that I suggested earlier remains an important part of the way that we can continue to keep Wales safe. It's completely consistent with the step-by-step way in which we have gone about dealing with the impact of coronavirus over the whole 2 years. You saw on the slide that Wales has the lowest level of coronavirus of any of the 4 nations. I think that our way of doing things has succeeded. I think it has continued to secure the support of the bulk of the population in Wales, and I don't intend to throw all that away in what we hope will be the final stages of dealing with the emergency phase of the pandemic.
Thank you. And we've been speaking with retail workers who say they've been receiving verbal abuse over mask wearing and people just simply not understanding the rules during the pandemic. Now, one survey suggests that in the last 12 months, 90% of shop workers have received verbal abuse. Now, obviously, they've made a big sacrifice throughout the pandemic being key workers. What protections are you going to implement going forward for them? And I suppose, how can it be made up?
Well, look, the first thing to say is it is entirely unacceptable that anybody going about their ordinary, everyday earning a living should be abused by somebody else for any reason. And Dan, you're absolutely right. You know, in the worst days of the pandemic, when we knew far less about it, when we had no protections from vaccine, amongst those groups of people who went to work every day to make sure the rest of us could go on having food on the table were people in the retail sector. So I very much pay tribute to the work that they have done on our behalf. And as I say, abuse is absolutely unacceptable. From, as you know, when I speak to USDO, the trade union that represents those workers and people who've been on the front line, they always emphasise that it is a small minority of people who behave in that way. But most people continue to do what is asked of them, to behave respectfully of other people and people who work in those settings. But, you know, that small minority, you go home at the end of the day and you remember them, even when you are not thinking about all those other people who've done the right thing. So the health and safety requirements will remain in law after the 28th of March. We are removing the coronavirus-specific requirements, but that doesn't mean that obligations on employers to carry out a risk assessment in workplaces and to make sure that risks are properly mitigated, those will remain in the law as they were before coronavirus began. And we will be working with our trade union colleagues and with employers who in Wales, in my experience, want to do the right thing to make sure that where there are risks of the sort that you described, that we still deal with them. And it is a responsibility of managers of those premises, not the people on the front line themselves, to take the lead in making sure that where there is entirely unacceptable behaviour of that sort for any reason, that it is dealt with, and that people on the front line are not expected simply to tolerate it or to absorb it as part of what it means to work in that setting. Dan, diolch yn fawr. And last of all today, in a small but of course select group of contributors, over to Will Hayward at Wales Online.
Yes, perfectly formed group of contributors, really.
Absolutely.
How much do you expect cases and hospitalisations to rise once you lift further measures? And how different would this plan have been if the UK government had continued to fund things like PCR tests?
I don't think we have an expectation that cases will necessarily rise because of the actions we're taking, because you will see that we are timing our actions very carefully against the seasonality of coronavirus as well. By the time we move into the time of year when we move into a world in which the legal requirements have been removed and the testing availability has been reduced, we will be in the better time of year as well. So I think there'll be a combination of factors, and it won't necessarily mean that we would expect to see a rise in numbers. Had we succeeded in persuading the UK government to take a more gradual and more proportionate approach to running down the testing regime, I think we would have been able to have kept more going for longer. And if we'd been in that position, that is what we would have done. Now, let me say, I do think it was right and inevitable that the level of testing that you could sustain in the steady state part of coronavirus rather than the emergency phase was going to be lower. It's not an argument about reducing, it's an argument about the speed at which you reduce testing and what you have left when you reach that steady state. We would have slowed things down at a more proportionate rate, and we would have liked to have seen a higher level of testing remaining. In the end, when the UK government makes these decisions, they have a direct effect on us. When the IP5 laboratory in Newport is closed by the UK government, as they intend to do, then that's a resource lost to Wales. When we don't have Barnet consequentials coming to us to help us to go on with a level of testing that we might have preferred, then we don't have the money to do everything we would have wished to do. So we've had to plan within the constraints that we unavoidably face.
Thank you. Simon Hart has said he wishes Wales hadn't made its own rules during the pandemic, while prominent Conservative Lord Frost said it was nonsense that Wales had different rules to England. Given these repeated attacks, how under threat do you think Wales's ability to make its own decisions independent of Westminster are in the future? And are you concerned about this?
Well, I think it's just important for me to say that the level of responsibility that we had in Wales to make decisions was the level of responsibility that the cabinet to which the Secretary of State of Wales belonged decided we should have at the outset. You know, it was the UK government who made the original decisions about where responsibilities should lie. And I think it's shocking that he should feel no responsibility at all for the decision of which he was a part. Now, the broader history of the Johnson government has been of, muscular unionism, one in which the powers and the financial resources available to devolved governments have been under attack. I think that is bad for the United Kingdom. I've said this many times, and I've said it directly to UK ministers. The Welsh Government believes that Wales is better off in the United Kingdom and that the United Kingdom is better off for having Wales in it. We need respectful relationships that recognise that the powers of the Senedd were confirmed in 2 referendums by people in Wales, and that continual raids on the powers and the responsibilities of the Senedd is not the way in which to persuade people that the United Kingdom is a deal that they are keen to sign up to. There's a better future for the United Kingdom than that, and I hope that the UK government will begin to realise that and to act accordingly. Diolch yn fawr.
Thank you.
Thank you all very much indeed.